Namaskar and welcome to Indian Diplomacy, show on Doordarshan, India's national television channel on Indian foreign policy, India's international relations, and important developments in key countries and regions of the world that have a bearing on India's rise as a leading power. Viewers, in this episode, we are taking a close look at the US presidential election 2024. This year, there are approximately 64 elections scheduled around the world, but probably the most consequential of them all is going to be in the United States. So what is this contest about? What kind of impact is it going to have on the world? And how should different countries prepare for potential changes in the US polity after this election? This is the theme that we're discussing in this episode. And to delve deep into the subject, I have a great expert joining me from London, United Kingdom, Dr. Leslie Vinjamuri. Dr. Vinjamuri is director of the US and Americas program at Chatham House, an important think tank in the UK. And she's also professor of international relations at SOAS University of London. Dr. Vinjamuri, welcome to Indian Diplomacy.
Thank you so much. It's great to be with you.
To begin with, this is being called the most consequential US election ever. And there is a lot of excitement building up, and already many countries around the world are wondering how they should adjust, not even for the outcome, which will be many months down the line, but just the campaign itself seems to have triggered so much a flurry of responses. So I'd like you to begin, Professor Vinjamuri, by talking about how important is this election in your view. And you've written recently in Foreign Policy that this presents a stark contrast in terms of worldviews and policies, and it's unlike historically what we've known about the US. This looks like it's not Tweedledum and Tweedledee, but something quite different and distinct, the choice. So please tell us how important you think this election is and this contrasting choice.
Yeah, no, exactly. What you've said is exactly right. We used to believe, and there was good evidence to believe, that when a president changed, foreign policy was broadly bipartisan. There were very significant changes, often domestically at home, when it came to economic and social policies, but that there was a broad consensus. This was certainly the case through the Cold War, and even in the post-Cold War period. But now, as we look ahead, the two candidates, they're not formally selected yet, but it looks all but certain that Donald Trump and Joe Biden are likely to be the two candidates, really present quite radically different views of the world. Joe Biden, as we know, cares about partners. He cares about working with allies. He's a multilateralist. He's an Atlanticist who is also looking at the Indo-Pacific, clearly cares a lot about America's relationship with India and is focused on China. But at heart, he really is an Atlanticist. And he has a very certain view of the global economy and of what we've come to know as Biden economics, of Bidenomics. Donald Trump is a very different figure. We have some sense of him from the 4 years that he was in office, but even if he were to be reelected, we would be looking at a different Donald Trump, a Donald Trump who is prepared for this, who has thought about this, who rejects that notion that America benefits from working multilaterally with partners and allies. He sees the multilateral order as one that has betrayed the interests of many of Americans, where Americans have been taken for a ride and have paid too much, frankly, for what they get back. So this is a presidential candidate now who is transactional, who has a very different temperament and style, who has a fondness for Vladimir Putin and for Russia that baffles many Americans and worries many Americans in the context of the war in Ukraine. But just generally as a person, as a temperament, as a policy, in terms of his basic beliefs about world order and America's rightful position in it, they're really two very different candidates.
Two different candidates, Dr. Vinjamuri, and also if we then go down to the granular level, I mean, if you look at the global crisis at present, already they seem to be making a play during the campaigning in the US elections. I've heard Donald Trump say on Fox News that, look, America, we have the ocean between us and Russia, and the Europeans are not paying for the defense of Ukraine. Why should we be shelling out all the money? And frankly, Russia is a war machine, and there's no reason for us to, continue supporting European security against Russia. So already that seems like a big salvo that's been fired, and has created a lot of reactions in the continent of Europe as to whether they have to be all alone. And this is really the question in a way, even with the multilateralist and the liberal internationalist that you just described, which is Biden. Even with the current administration, there's already a lot of disappointment and hand-wringing that they're not doing enough to protect allies and partners. So with Trump coming in, it's likely that a lot of these partners and allies will need to, quote unquote, Trump-proof themselves, or find some other means, maybe endogenous coalitions within their own regions, rather than relying on this offshore backer, which seems to be becoming more and more unreliable.
Look, you're exactly right. There is already a tremendous degree of uncertainty. I was in Munich for the Munich Security Conference before I traveled to India for the Raisina Dialogue. And in Munich, the conversation was dominated by a concern that the US wasn't committed, that already in this campaign, which is still in primary season, that there's a difficulty getting that bill, that supplemental bill that would provide us more assistance to Ukraine. It's being blocked by the House Speaker, who refuses to bring it to a vote, in large part because Donald Trump already has his hand on the party and has, sent the signal that he doesn't want a deal done at this point. There is an expectation that after Super Tuesday, that supplemental is possibly likely to be passed, but nonetheless, that cast of uncertainty is driving Europeans to be very concerned about their own spending, about working together, about developing the supplies on basic things like ammunition that we know are so critical. And even if Donald Trump were to be elected, it's unclear. Even if Joe Biden were to be elected, it's unclear that he would be able to deliver the kind of certainty and security, given where we already are, given where the Congress is, and given the extent to which the former president has really fundamentally altered the domestic context in which America makes its choices. But, I think we also have to remember that America is and has been thinking very hard about its priorities. And those, and this is a bipartisan commitment. Those really sit in the Indo-Pacific. There is a bipartisan consensus on the importance of America's relationship with India. There is agreement on the threat that China's rise presents for the US and its partners, but there isn't an agreement on exactly how to go about handling that, what policies and what role diplomacy it should play in America's engagement.
Yes, and Dr. Vinjamuri, you mentioned Asia already and in the Indo-Pacific, but if we also take a look at the other big crisis that's roiling the world today, the Israel-Hamas war that's been on for almost 5 months now, and that too seems to be having ripple effects in the US election, especially within the Democratic Party. There's a lot of opposition to President Biden's support for Israel. And it looks like that might also have an impact or a bearing. Because normally we say that the US elections are decided by domestic economic and other identity and social wedge issues and such things. But it looks like some of these foreign policy issues as to how the US should be dealing with major crises seem to be already creating a flutter and possibly pressurizing the incumbent President Joe Biden about his own approach to these problems, because traditionally he has been a very pro-Israel politician within the Democratic Party, but looks like that cannot be sustained as well. And on the other hand, you have Trump and the Republicans, who are all very solidly, or even you can say extremely pro-Israel. So in that point, from that West Asia or Middle East perspective as well, it looks like there are quite some sharp differences that are going to emerge during this US election.
Well, first of all, I think the U.S. commitment to Israel will endure. It's not a new fact. It's not a partisan fact. It is a enduring commitment in the U.S. at this point in time. But you're absolutely right that it is being challenged by the nature of Israel's response. And when young Americans in particular, when Arab Americans also look at the death toll in Gaza, the tragedy that Palestinians are facing, they simply don't see a justification for the U.S. Support of this. And even though behind closed doors, there has been a very concerted effort by the Biden administration to engage in diplomacy, to try and persuade Israel to protect civilians, to allow humanitarian relief. And the proof, as they say, the proof is in the pudding. The results are on the ground, and it is very grave for innocent Palestinians. And this is playing out across some college campuses in the United States, at Harvard and Columbia University. We've seen very significant divisions amongst students, many of whom are supportive of Palestinians, donors, many of whom are supportive of Israel. And that is playing out in the House. It's playing out in the White House, and it's quite possibly going to play out, as you intimate, in the elections. We saw in Michigan, which held a primary, that there were several thousand, I think 30,000 non-committed voters registering a protest in the Democratic primary against President Biden for not restraining Israel. But I would say we are many months away from this election. It's very unclear whether that foreign policy concern will actually motivate voters who are, primarily vote on the basis of economics, their own position, their sense of their livelihood, their feeling about the presidential candidate. So it is a long time away. And as we know, Biden and his team are working very hard to try and secure some sort of agreement that would combine hostage relief with with some form of ceasefire. So it's difficult to predict how the current political environment in the Middle East will play out in these elections, since they are several months away.
Yeah. And Dr. Vinjamuri, there's one more foreign policy issue that seems to be at the top of the ticket for many voters in the US. And this is the whole fracas about immigration and how hard the US should be in preventing immigration from Latin America. So on this issue, also it looks like there's a divide. And I think from what I've read, it looks like one of the decisive factors, especially for the Trump voters, is going to be to make it a fortress America and to prevent these quote-unquote bad people from entering our country. So on that front, what do you think it conveys to the world? Because normally we would assume that left of center or right of center presidents in the US would tinker at the margins, but generally some kind of open door, humanitarian open door would be there. But since the advent of Trump and since this backlash against immigration, it looks like that's a cardinal principle of the so-called liberal international order that the US built after World War II, and especially after the Cold War, after 1991. That has come crashing down, isn't it? I mean, there doesn't seem to be any agreement at all in the US on this matter, and it's either a black or a white kind of a situation with very little gray. So what does that convey about the role of the US in the world? They often say, especially the Biden camp, they say that we are upholding the liberal order. But is the US really doing so when you look at immigration?
Well, first of all, the facts of immigration at the southern border have become significantly more problematic in the last several months and in the last few years. And so we are facing a different context. And President Biden is facing pressure not only from Republicans, but also from many Democratic leaders across certain key states who simply can't manage the flow of immigration. And so there is undoubtedly a need for comprehensive immigration reform. That's been the case for some time. It's very difficult to get through Congress. There is a need for some solution at the southern border, but there's a very significant debate over what that should be. And it's become, as you say, it's become intensely political. And the MAGA wing of the Republican Party is using this to beat up on the current president. And the overall effect of this is that, yes, America is looking like globally a country that doesn't care about immigrants, that doesn't care about people who are in need or who are searching for a better life, who are sometimes fleeing a violent situation. And historically, the United States is an immigrant nation. My father came as a young professional from India. And this is the American dream, that you can move across borders and build a good life. And I think, President Biden is certainly still committed to that, as are many Americans, but the political context is very, very problematic. Most ordinary Americans see immigration as a very significant threat. They're very concerned that the Democrats don't have this under control. And what we've seen since the New Hampshire primary is that the former president, Donald Trump, is seeking to really use this issue to portray President Biden as weak, as unable to secure Americans because he cannot secure the southern border. So this issue, both President Biden and President Trump were down at making visits to the border. This is going to continue to influence electoral politics. And it comes at a time where across the world, the problem of migration is only going to grow. Much of it will be related to climate and climate-induced environmental problems that lead people to need to leave their homes. And the U.S. really needs to get out in front of this globally and begin to help to find realistic, pragmatic solutions that still allow people the opportunities that they deserve and that they need. But at the moment, the political environment is really obstructing progress in that area.
Yeah, it looks like the domestic factors are hampering the traditional US role in the world quite a bit these days. And let's focus a bit now, Dr. Vinjamuri, on Trump. And, the million-dollar question everyone has is, what if Trump is back in the White House? In your assessment, you've been studying this so-called right-wing populism in the US for a long time. Do you think it's going to be Trump 2.0, let's say, if it happens, is going to be exactly like Trump 1.0, or will he be even more radical this time with many of his ideas? I mean, when he says, I'm not going to pay for allies and their security, and Russia can do whatever the hell it wants. Maybe he wants to do a deal with China. I mean, sometimes he talks about that too, that he's smart enough to do a deal with the Chinese. So that creates a lot of jitters in Asia as well as to what is the value of US security guarantees. So if Trump is back, how do you think different regions of the world will respond? I mean, already we talked about the Europeans trying to form their own indigenous, defense mechanisms and deterrence mechanisms. Probably other regions of the world also, like-minded countries will come together, and the dependence on the US, in a way, from looking at it from here, from India or elsewhere, it looks like maybe Trump is like a blessing in disguise, because he forces people to shed dependence on the US, and to develop more autonomous capabilities. So in the process, even if the US quote-unquote global leadership declines and the US withdraws and becomes isolationist, at least the initiative and the agency to determine our own fates and our own security and prosperity seems to be coming back. So whenever there's Trump, it looks like we are moving in that post-American world direction, and maybe that's not a bad thing. Your thoughts?
Well, first of all, let me, state what we all know, which is that it's far from clear that Donald Trump will be reelected. He is, even in the primaries, he's hitting around 60%, which means in a race where the most committed voters turn out, he's not getting 40% of the vote, and the independents don't appear to be, turning out for Donald Trump. African Americans are still, ambivalent about the former president. So some very key demographics he's not yet winning in. So it's far from clear what happens. It certainly could be Donald Trump, but there is a huge amount to play for. And this is a man who probably, it looks like the first one of the next trials will begin likely in July on the question of classified documents. So there's all sorts of turmoil ahead. Having said this, America is changing. America is seeking to set very clear priorities. It is primarily concerned with China and China's rise and America's own competitiveness and ability to really bolster its economy, to innovate technologically. And it sees partners as critical to that. So yes, America is pushing others to take care of their own security and to be good partners on the question of economic cooperation. But there is, as you said, there's a very significant difference. And I think the question about Donald Trump is it's a very difficult one to answer because he is a narcissistic personality. He is erratic. He can change on a dime. And so that uncertainty certainly pushes other partners and allies and adversaries to hedge against what he might do. But a Trump 2.0 is one that will have a degree of measure behind it, in part because many organizations, and there's an effort called Project 2025, it's led by the Heritage Foundation, set out a 900-page plan for what a Trump 2.0 administration would look like. And some of those policies are, are fairly rational. But I guess that, to one of your questions, it's very hard to step away from the support of a country that spends $880 billion a year on defense, that has a global footprint. If you're going to make an alternative choice, you have to have an alternative, and it takes a long time. The choice is stark. That the alternative partner, China, I think is one that produces a lot of concern and fear. There's a lack of transparency. So it isn't as easy as just, walking away from American power. And let's be clear, Donald Trump is not exactly isolationist. He likes to win. He has plenty of views on how he'd like to engage internationally. He likes to do a deal. But if he isn't winning, if that deal isn't coming through, then he's likely to switch course. So I think above all, the dominating concern of many people will be, is America predictable, reliable, and certain? I think India actually is well positioned because, we've seen from Donald Trump and from Joe Biden that the U.S.-India partnership, when it comes to security, defense, co-production, even technological sharing, a shared affinity between two great democracies. All of this is very robust. It's very powerful. And so this is, one of the few relationships where I think there is actually a great deal of security and predictability in the years ahead.
That's right. In fact, Dr. Vinjamuri, last time also when Trump was in power, it looked like if there was one major relationship of the US that was not in big trouble, there were some, trade related, trade war type measures against India as well. But overall, I think that pivot to Asia, which was the original term of the Obama administration, then the Indo-Pacific, which was the Trump administration's main focus, Indo-Pacific shift did happen, and I expect that at least will not be subject to any erratic whims or fancies of any incumbent. But last word, Dr. Vinjamuri, looking at this overall, there seems to be so much volatility, right? I mean, and policy shifts because of this polarization within the US. So in that sense, the US has historically had this great image as being an alliance builder and an alliance manager, and now they also have strategic partnerships which are short of alliance, like with India. But now it looks like the US is really mismanaging or incapable of managing all these partners and allies. So that multilateralist US seems like it's gone missing. And do you think that this is a sign of American decline in the world, relatively speaking, or you see this as just a cycle, and who knows, after 4 more years we may go back to quote unquote again liberal internationalism? This looks like a seesaw, and but nothing seems to be certain at all about the US and its role in the world anymore? Your final comments.
I mean, look, there are many countries, and India is one of them, China is one of them. There are others who have a lot more power, who have a lot more ability to make big requests. And the US isn't always sure of how to play in this new world. It is working it out. But I think from the Biden administration, we've seen a pretty clear commitment to working with allies and partners, but it's being done in part outside of the major historical multilaterals because, you know, they're stuck because the great powers are at odds with each other. But there's a determination to work through things like the Quad and other partnerships, AUKUS. So I think there's still a hint of multilateralism. It's still there. It's a very different order. There are multiple options, but there is a solutions-driven, problems-driven instinct for how you solve those now. But, you know, when it comes to climate change and technological change and security and defense and migration, they have to be done together. So there is still going to be a very clear effort to work with partners.
Yes, and Dr. Vinjamuri, last and final word, can one rely on a volatile USA? I mean, this is the question everyone is going to ask. Is it a dependable friend and an ally anymore, or not? And if not, then its importance from the eyes of many world capitals seems to be waning, right? And so do you think we should just wait out and see how this whole cycle and the flip-flops in terms of policies, or do you think that at the core, you talked about the capabilities, the defense and the spending, and you know the US has a great power that of course will remain perhaps for a while. So do you think that we should look up to the US, or that era is over now?
I think you've got to have a multi-pronged strategy. Remember that our societies are large and diverse. Our businesses are powerful, both in India, in the United States, in much of Europe. And so those private connections, universities cooperating are absolutely fundamental. So I think doubling down on that relationship with the US is critical. Hedging against, at the official level, America not being the friendly, open partner that it's always been is extremely important. But it is a very complex world that we live in. And one has to both hedge and also invest at the same time. It's extremely complex, but unfortunately, there is no alternative.
Viewers, Dr. Leslie Vinjamuri says there is no alternative, and it's a complex world. And a great power is a great power, and people will continue to work with the US no matter what happens with the elections. But there are going to be many surprises, and we don't know where it's all going to end. So let's watch out for this roller coaster ride called the US presidential election. It's a long season of campaigning and primaries and rallies, all leading up to the crescendo in November 2024, when people actually vote and choose the next US president. I want to thank Dr. Leslie Vinjamuri for valuable insights. Thank you so much. It's an honor hosting you.
Thank you. Wonderful to be with you.
So viewers, let's keep an eye on the US presidential election. Whether it is Biden or Trump, countries around the world are preparing and already strategizing for it, and so is India. And given our past experience of managing the bipartisan nature of India policy in the US, we seem to be comfortable, but you cannot rule out some surprises and rough rides along the way. Let's follow the US election throughout 2024. I'll see you again next time. Until then, take care.